Hi, I'm Carolyn Forte from Excellence in Education, and I'm here as Carolyn's Corner to answer your questions and give some helpful advice to help you in your homeschool journey. I was a public school teacher before I homeschooled my kids, and since 1991, um, I have been advising and helping homeschoolers um, and trying to give as much encouragement as I can to them. So today, I'd like to talk about something that comes up almost every day at EIE. Somebody says to me some variation of, I don't want my children to get behind. I am worried that my child is behind. I want to keep up with what they're doing in the schools. So I'd like to address that. Um, I'm going to need to explain some principles of child development and how they relate to our schools. Going back 100 years ago, children often didn't start school until the age of 8 to 12. This was completely normal. Little House on the Prairie schools did not have grades. Children moved along through the materials as at the pace that they could handle. So you didn't ask, what grade are you in? You asked, what book are you in? So um, but going back even 200 years, children often were not admitted to school unless they could read already. It was considered such a simple thing to teach a child to read that teachers wanted to have them reading before they went to school. Well, we live in a different world now. Back in the 1920s, and somewhat before that, our modern factory schools were developed mainly by the captains of industry. And by 1950, many children entered kindergarten at age 5. But at that point, kindergarten was developmental. There were no academics. It was playing, singing, learning to jump rope, getting hand-eye coordination developed, things like that. It was mostly play, and it was to develop the children's senses and motor skills. But moving forward, by 1970, reading was starting to be pushed down into kindergarten. By 1990, we now see some kindergartens expect children to be reading when they enter the kindergarten. So this is all the way down to 4-year-olds being taught to read, supposedly. It's not working out very well. We have an awful lot of dysfunction, and I'd like to explain why developmentally trying to teach children to read that early is an enormous problem. So the modern homeschool movement began in the 1960s, and encouraged by John Holt, who published a book, Teach Your Own. He published a number of books, and one of them was How Children Learn. He also published a book titled How Children Fail. He really was a genius, and he had some very important things to say about the way children learn. So people started to follow him and his advice about teaching your own child at home. He published that book in 1967. Then in the 1970s, Dr. Raymond Moore, who was he was an educator, with lots of credentials who ended up at the Department of Education, sorry, in Washington. And he learned about this homeschool movement and he was curious. He thought all along that children should wait and not enter school until they were around 8. And that probably sounds really radical to you. But when I started teaching in 1970, 8 was the age that children were required to enter school in California. In those days, children were required to attend school for 8 years, from age 8 to age 16. So things have changed an awful lot since then. But Dr. Moore was very much in agreement with that, what he knew of child development. But he and his wife, Dorothy, started doing even more research. They started studying homeschoolers and what was successful and what was not so successful. As you can imagine, homeschooling was extremely eclectic in those days. People just did whatever they thought was going to be the best thing for their children. So some would buy a packaged curriculum. There were a very few publishers that would sell a packaged curriculum to homeschoolers. And others were just winging it on their own. They would go pick up used books wherever they could, a little math workbook or at the drugstore, and go on that way. So there was a huge variety, as there still is today, of the way that people homeschool their children. So Dr. Moore decided to look deeply into this, and he found mountains of research in neurology, ophthalmology, audiology that showed these areas of physical development were not mature and did not coordinate well until a child was at least 8 and sometimes as late as 12 or even older, depending on the circumstances for that particular child. So it's not very well known, but very young children don't discriminate colors as well as older children and adults. So if they're confused by red and orange, it's not because there's anything wrong with their brains. It's because they literally cannot see the difference yet. Their eyes have not developed to the point where they can do that. Same, and actually, optometrists will tell you that a child's eyes do not fully mature until they're about 8. So trying to focus on reading and math and so on is much more difficult for a child under the age of 8 than it is for a child who's 8 and older. So that's part of the reason that Dr. Moore suggests that you wait, because everything will move much, much faster and it'll be much easier. It's not that your child can't learn many, many things when they're younger, but keep in mind the developmental readiness. Then another thing that's not well known is that the sense of hearing isn't fully developed in young children. So telling the difference between b and p, or telling the difference between a, ah, they don't hear it. So they're confused and they struggle. And then parents start to worry. What's wrong with my child? Well, because you're doing the right thing and you're trying to teach phonics, but your child's hearing is immature. You haven't given it time to develop. When I was a fairly new teacher, I was assigned first grade. After a couple of years, I moved districts and I had a first grade class, and I had some children that struggled, as you can imagine. Well, guess what the principal told me? Don't worry about it. They'll be fine when they get to be 7 or 8. That's when the light goes on. So the other teachers and the principal knew that from experience. I don't know if they knew it from research, but that's what I was told. And sure enough, it's exactly what Dr. Moore talks about in his books. Um, uh, One of his first books was this Better Late Than Early. I don't think it's still in print, but it's um, very valuable information. However, he does have a book that it is in print, The Successful Homeschool Family Handbook, and in it he and his wife Dorothy have covered most of the information that was in Better Late Than Early. So you can still access that really important information. So, um, as Dr. Moore became more and more prominent in supporting homeschooling, he was on Focus on the Family radio many times. He spoke at many, many homeschool conventions, and he actually was an expert witness in a number of trials of homeschool parents who were being taken to court because they were homeschooling their children back before we had homeschool legal defense and much better laws in most of the states. So Dr. Moore advised to wait for formal education until a child was at least 8 and maybe as old as 12. Some people, that sounds just drastic and extreme, but I can tell you from experience that uh, it's very sensible. And many, many children are being labeled with all kinds of learning disabilities that wouldn't exist if they were just given a little bit more time to mature so that their senses were ready. Now, delaying formal academics, and by that I mean reading a textbook, doing workbooks, taking tests, all of those things that we associate with school, those we don't have to do those, but it doesn't mean children can't learn all sorts of things. Many children will be reading long before that, and that's fine. Let them read, give them good materials. If they're not reading yet, as my kids were late readers, read to them. They're soaking up information. So you can teach them all sorts of things. Children need to be um, they learn by play mainly. In fact, scientists have discovered that it takes close to 400 repetitions to create a new synapse in the brain, unless you do it with play, in which case it takes 10 to 20 repetitions. So you want to do the 400 times with a flashcard, or you want to play a math game. So here's another really, really good book, The Power of Play, Learning What Comes Naturally by David Elkind. He also wrote a book called The Hurried Child. So I think you have an idea what that was about. Um, he also wrote Miseducation, Preschoolers at Risk. Right now, we have a lot of preschoolers who are at risk because they're being pushed beyond what they should be asked to do developmentally. Child development is very, very important. Another researcher wrote, Jane Healy, PhD, she wrote Endangered Minds. And one of the main points she had was how damaging preschool can be to children. She said it actually retards language development. And the reason for that is that they will be mainly mimicking the language of other 3-year-olds, not the language they hear from adults at home. So you're wondering, well, if I wait and I don't push my child into academics early, what is going to happen? How's he going to go to high school? How's he going? Well, Dr. Moore covered that too. His research showed that it only takes about 2.5 years to prepare for high school if you start when you're ready, if you start when you can hit the ground running. And I can tell you from experience that that's very, very true. So I hope this has been helpful to you. If you have questions, if you want more research, I'll be happy to provide it. So there's actually one more little thing I can tell you about. There is a website, DEY.org. It stands for Defending the Early Years. And there is an article in there about research that has been recently done. It's called Reading Instruction in Kindergarten, Little to Gain and Much to Lose. And it's very, very worthwhile reading. So I do recommend that. Thank you for listening, and have a blessed homeschool day.